Sam Blakeman had always been a boy who lived inside his own thoughts, a quiet observer of the world rather than someone who rushed to be part of it. But now, those thoughts had begun to turn against him, twisting into something darker, something he could no longer control. The lines between what he saw and what was real had started to blur, and with each passing day, that fragile boundary seemed to crumble a little more. It had not happened all at once. At first, it was just a feeling, an unease that crept into his chest without warning, like a shadow passing over sunlight. Then came the moments he could not explain, the sensation of being watched, the sudden certainty that someone was standing just behind him even when he turned and found nothing there. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself that it was just his imagination running wild, but the more he resisted, the stronger those moments became. Earlier that week, the fear had taken a more defined shape. Sam had seen Will Driscoll at school, standing across the yard with that unmistakable look in his eyes, a mixture of anger and accusation that seemed directed at him alone. The sight had frozen Sam in place, his breath catching in his throat as memories rushed back, tangled with guilt and confusion. He had wanted to run, but his legs refused to move, as if rooted to the ground by something far deeper than fear. Later, when he saw Will again at the red wreck, the panic returned with a force he could no longer contain. The confrontation that followed had felt painfully real, every word cutting through him like a blade. Will had blamed him, accused him of ruining everything, of exposing a truth that should have remained hidden. Sam could still hear the anger in his voice, still feel the weight of those accusations pressing down on him. And yet, what made it all so much worse was the truth he would later be told, that Will had never been there at all. That realization did not bring relief. Instead, it shattered something inside him. If Will had not been there, then what had he seen? What had he heard? The telescope he had smashed in that moment of panic became more than just broken glass and twisted metal. It was a symbol of something much deeper breaking inside him. A loss of control, a loss of certainty, a loss of trust in his own mind. By the time the next day came, Sam was already struggling to hold himself together. The world around him felt distant, as if he were moving through it behind a pane of glass. When he walked through the ginnel and thought he saw Will again, the fear surged back instantly, sharper than before. He reacted without thinking, lashing out as if trying to defend himself from something only he could see. But when it was over, when the echoes of his own movements faded, there was nothing there. No Will, no confrontation, just empty space and the crushing realization that he had been fighting shadows. That moment lingered in his mind, replaying over and over again as he tried to make sense of it. Each time he reached the same conclusion, and each time it felt more terrifying than the last. If he could not trust what he saw, then what could he trust? If his own senses were betraying him, then where did that leave him? Alone, he thought, completely and utterly alone. That feeling of isolation only deepened when Nick and Toya sat him down to explain what was happening with Megan. Their voices were calm, measured, trying to be reassuring, but Sam could barely focus on the words themselves. Megan was pleading not guilty. The case would go to trial. There was a chance he might have to give evidence. Each piece of information landed heavily, but instead of clarity, it only added to the storm already raging inside him. The idea of standing in court, of speaking about everything he had seen and felt, filled him with a dread he could not put into words. How could he explain something he no longer fully understood himself? How could he convince anyone else when he was no longer sure what was real and what was not? The thought alone made his chest tighten, his breathing shallow as panic threatened to take over. Later, when he put on his headphones and tried to escape into music, he hoped for a moment of silence, a brief respite from the chaos inside his head. But even that was taken from him. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound beneath the music, something he could not quite place. Then it grew clearer, more distinct, until there was no mistaking it. A voice. Will's voice. It spoke to him as if it had always been there, as if it belonged in his mind. The words were not loud, but they were impossible to ignore, slipping through the music and settling deep within him. Sam's heart began to race, his hands trembling as he pulled off the headphones, expecting the voice to stop. But it didn't. It lingered, echoing faintly, as if it had found a permanent place inside him. Desperate for something real to hold onto, Sam turned his attention to the CCTV monitor, watching Nick and Toya in the other room. At first, it was just a way to ground himself, to remind himself that there was still a world outside his thoughts. But then, slowly, that sense of reality began to shift. The way they moved, the way their lips formed words, it started to feel wrong, as if something beneath the surface did not match what he was seeing. He leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the screen, trying to read their expressions. And then it happened. He became convinced that they were talking about him, that their voices, though he could not hear them, were filled with disappointment, with shame. The words seemed to form clearly in his mind. Ashamed. They were ashamed of him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It confirmed every fear that had been building inside him, every doubt he had tried to push away. If even they felt that way, if even the people closest to him were judging him, then there was nothing left to hold on to. No safe place, no one to turn to. The weight of that belief pressed down on him until it felt impossible to breathe. His chest tightened, his vision blurring as tears threatened to spill over. He tried to fight it, to tell himself that it wasn't true, that it couldn't be true, but the voice inside him was stronger. It told him what to believe, what to feel, what to fear. And in that moment, he had no defense against it. "I'm on my own," he admitted quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. They felt heavy, final, as if he was stating a truth that could no longer be denied. There was no anger in his voice, no defiance, just a deep, overwhelming sadness that seemed to settle into every part of him. That sense of isolation did not fade as the day went on. If anything, it grew stronger, feeding off every glance, every word, every moment that felt even slightly out of place. Sam began to withdraw further into himself, his thoughts turning inward as he tried to make sense of a reality that no longer felt stable. And yet, beneath all of it, there was something else, something darker that he could not fully articulate. A feeling that whatever was happening to him was not over, that this was only the beginning, that the line between what was real and what was not would continue to blur until he could no longer tell the difference at all. He did not know how right he was. The silence that followed Sam's quiet admission did not bring him any comfort. Instead, it seemed to stretch endlessly around him, thick and suffocating, as though the world itself had stepped back and left him alone inside his own thoughts. Every sound felt distant, distorted, as if filtered through something invisible that separated him from everything real. From that moment on, something inside Sam shifted. It was no longer just fear. It was suspicion, creeping slowly into every corner of his mind. He began to question everything, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet, relentless manner that never gave him a moment of rest. Every glance, every word, every movement from those around him started to carry a hidden meaning he could not fully grasp but could not ignore either. He watched Nick more closely than before, searching for signs that what he had seen on the CCTV monitor might be true. There was nothing obvious, nothing that confirmed his fears, yet that only made things worse. The absence of proof did not reassure him, it unsettled him. It felt like something was being hidden from him, something just out of reach, like a truth everyone else could see but him. Toya's presence, once comforting, now carried the same unsettling weight. When she spoke, Sam found himself focusing less on her words and more on the tone beneath them, the pauses, the subtle shifts in her expression. He convinced himself that there was something unspoken, something she was deliberately keeping from him. It wasn't that he wanted to distrust her, it was that he no longer knew how not to. As all this was happening, the memory of Megan pleading not guilty began to settle deeper into his mind. It was not just a piece of information anymore, it became a source of pressure, something that loomed over him constantly. The idea of the trial, of having to stand up and speak, grew heavier with each passing hour. It felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. He tried to imagine what it would be like, to stand in front of strangers, to explain everything that had happened. But every time he reached that point in his thoughts, he hit the same wall. How could he explain something he could not fully understand himself? How could he talk about Will when Will wasn't even there? The contradiction twisted inside him, leaving him feeling trapped between two realities that refused to align. At the same time, the voice he had heard earlier did not disappear. It lingered at the edges of his awareness, faint but persistent, like an echo that refused to fade. Sometimes it was so subtle he could almost convince himself it wasn't there. Other times, it was clearer, more defined, slipping into his thoughts without warning. It did not always say the same thing, but the feeling it left behind was always the same. Accusation, blame, a reminder that he was responsible, that he had caused something he could not undo. Sam tried to push it away, to drown it out with distractions, but the more he resisted, the more it seemed to push back. Not long after, the world around him began to feel even less stable. It was not just about what he heard anymore, it was about what he believed. The certainty he once had in his own perception was gone, replaced by a constant state of doubt. He found himself questioning whether anything he experienced could be trusted, whether any moment could suddenly shift into something else entirely. That uncertainty followed him everywhere, even in the simplest situations. Walking down the street, he felt eyes on him, even when there was no one there. Sitting quietly, he would suddenly become aware of a presence he could not see. It was as if something invisible was always just out of sight, watching, waiting. And then came the moment that would push him even further. It started quietly, almost insignificantly. Sam was going through his school bag, his movements slow and distracted, his thoughts still tangled in everything that had happened. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to keep his hands busy, to give himself something real to focus on. That was when he found it. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It was small, unfamiliar, something that didn't belong among his books and belongings. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands, his brow furrowing as confusion gave way to something else. Recognition, not of what it was exactly, but of what it might mean. A tracking device. The thought formed slowly, but once it did, it took hold instantly. His heart began to race, his fingers tightening around the object as a cold wave of fear washed over him. It wasn't just the presence of the device, it was what it implied. Someone had put it there. Someone had been watching him, following him. The realization sent his thoughts spiraling. Who would do that? Why him? How long had it been there? Each question fed into the next, building a chain of fear that quickly became overwhelming. He tried to think logically, to consider other explanations, but his mind refused to settle. Every possibility seemed to lead to the same conclusion, that he was not safe, that he was being targeted in some way he could not fully understand. Even so, there was another layer to it, something deeper and more unsettling. A part of him, buried beneath the fear, began to question whether the device itself was real. After everything that had happened, after everything he had seen and heard, how could he be sure? What if this was just another illusion? Another trick his mind was playing on him? But the object felt real in his hands. Solid, tangible. It was there, undeniable. And that made it even more terrifying. Because if it was real, then everything he feared might also be real. His breathing became uneven, his chest tightening as panic took hold. The world around him seemed to shrink, closing in until there was nothing left but the device in his hand and the storm raging inside his mind. He could not think clearly, could not separate one thought from another. Everything blurred together into a single, overwhelming sense of danger. By the time Roy Cropper found him, Sam was no longer trying to make sense of it. He was simply holding on, clutching the device as if it were the only proof that what he was experiencing was not entirely inside his head. Roy approached him carefully, his presence calm but alert, as though he understood immediately that something was wrong. He did not rush, did not overwhelm Sam with questions. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, bringing himself to Sam's level, his voice gentle and steady. There was something grounding about Roy's presence, something that cut through the chaos just enough to give Sam a moment to breathe. But even then, the fear did not disappear. It lingered, clinging to him, whispering that even this moment of calm, might not be what it seemed. Because somewhere deep inside, the doubt had already taken root. And it was only beginning to grow. Roy Cropper did not react with alarm when he saw the device clutched tightly in Sam's trembling hands, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable, quiet and steady rather than loud or intrusive. He understood instinctively that this was not a moment that could be rushed or corrected with simple explanations, because whatever Sam was experiencing went far beyond the physical object itself. Sam could barely meet Roy's gaze at first, his attention fixed entirely on the small object as though it held all the answers he could no longer find within himself. His breathing remained uneven, shallow and fragile, while his mind continued to race through a tangled web of thoughts that refused to settle into anything coherent or safe. The presence of Roy beside him created a fragile sense of grounding, yet it was not enough to silence the fear that had already rooted itself deep inside. Roy spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision, not to dismiss what Sam was feeling but to create a space where those feelings could exist without immediately turning into something even more overwhelming. He did not question the device directly, nor did he attempt to explain it away too quickly, because he understood that certainty, when forced too soon, could shatter what little stability Sam still had left. Instead, he focused on Sam himself, on the visible distress that was written across his face and in the tension of his posture, as though the boy were holding himself together by sheer force of will. Sam listened, but his attention was divided, pulled constantly back to the possibility that something, or someone, was watching him, tracking him, moving just beyond the edges of his awareness. The device, small and silent, became a symbol of that fear, something tangible that seemed to confirm everything his mind had been trying to warn him about. It was no longer just a random object discovered in his bag, it became proof, in his mind, that his instincts had been right all along. The sensation of being observed, of being followed, of being targeted, it all converged into that one undeniable piece of evidence. As Roy continued speaking, his voice calm and unwavering, Sam found himself caught between two conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to believe Roy, to trust in the reassurance being offered, to accept that there might be a reasonable explanation for what he had found. But another part, louder and more insistent, refused to let go of the fear that had already taken hold. That inner conflict was exhausting, draining him of the little energy he had left. It felt as though he were being pulled in opposite directions at once, his thoughts splitting and reforming in ways that made it impossible to find a stable ground. Even the simplest conclusions became impossible to reach, because every answer immediately gave rise to another question, another doubt, another possibility that something was wrong. Roy eventually suggested they move somewhere quieter, away from the immediate environment that seemed to be amplifying Sam's distress. The idea was simple, practical, but to Sam it felt like a significant shift, as though leaving one space meant entering another unknown territory where anything could happen. Even so, he allowed himself to be guided, his movements slow and hesitant, still clutching the device as if letting go of it would mean losing his only connection to what felt real. As they walked together, the world around Sam appeared slightly distorted, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in something far more subtle and unsettling. Sounds seemed to echo faintly, as though delayed by a fraction of a second, while familiar surroundings took on a strange quality that made him feel both known and unfamiliar at the same time. It was not enough to confirm that something was wrong, but it was enough to keep him on edge, constantly alert. Roy stayed close, not intruding, not forcing conversation, but maintaining a presence that was steady and reliable. It was the kind of presence that did not demand trust but quietly invited it, offering Sam the possibility of safety without insisting upon it. For brief moments, that was enough to ease the tension slightly, allowing Sam to breathe a little more freely. However, the relief never lasted. As they reached the street, Sam's attention began to shift once again, drawn toward the movement of people around him. Every passerby became a potential threat, every glance a possible confirmation that he was being watched. His eyes moved quickly, scanning faces, trying to detect something hidden beneath ordinary expressions. The device in his hand seemed to pulse with significance, as though it were connected to everything he was seeing. Roy noticed the change immediately, the way Sam's posture stiffened, the way his gaze darted from one point to another without settling. He slowed his pace slightly, giving Sam time to adjust, but the adjustment never fully came. Instead, the tension continued to build, layer upon layer, until it felt as though it might spill over at any moment. At that very moment, a thought began to form in Sam's mind, quiet at first but growing steadily stronger. It was not triggered by anything specific that Roy said or did, but rather by the lingering uncertainty that had been building for days. If he could not trust what he saw, if he could not trust what he heard, then how could he trust anyone at all? That question lingered, repeating itself in different forms, each version more unsettling than the last. It did not matter that Roy had been kind, that he had shown patience and understanding. Those facts were no longer enough to counter the doubt that had already taken root. Because doubt, once established, did not need evidence to survive. It only needed space. Sam's grip on the device tightened as the thought continued to grow. What if Roy did know something? What if he was part of it? What if the calm reassurance was not genuine but calculated, a way to keep him from seeing the truth? The idea was irrational, but it did not feel that way to Sam. It felt possible. It felt real. Roy, unaware of the exact direction of Sam's thoughts but sensing the shift in his demeanor, continued to speak in the same steady tone, trying to anchor him in the present. He pointed out familiar places, ordinary details, anything that might help Sam reconnect with the reality around him. But even those attempts began to lose their effectiveness, because the reality Sam was experiencing no longer aligned with the one Roy was describing. As they moved further along the street, the distance between perception and reality seemed to widen, not visibly, but internally, within Sam's own mind. Each step forward felt uncertain, as though the ground beneath him might suddenly shift, revealing something hidden beneath the surface. The world had not changed, but his relationship to it had, and that change made everything feel unstable. Then, without warning, the voice returned. It was not loud, nor was it dramatic, but it was unmistakable. It slipped into his awareness with the same quiet persistence as before, bypassing all attempts to ignore it. This time, however, it carried something new, a sense of urgency, a warning that seemed directed specifically at him. The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. Do not trust anyone. Sam froze for a fraction of a second, his entire body reacting before his mind could catch up. The message echoed inside him, repeating itself, embedding deeper with each repetition. It did not matter that Roy was standing right beside him, that there was no visible source for the voice. The warning felt real, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. He did not say anything at first, but the change in his expression was enough to signal that something had shifted again. The fragile connection he had begun to rebuild with the outside world started to fracture once more, replaced by a renewed sense of isolation that was even more intense than before. Because now, it was no longer just about confusion or fear. Now, it was about survival. The warning did not fade after it first appeared in Sam's mind. Instead, it settled into him with a disturbing permanence, as though it had always belonged there and was only now revealing itself. The words did not echo loudly or demand attention in an obvious way, yet they lingered with a quiet authority that made them impossible to ignore, shaping his perception of everything that followed. From that moment on, Sam's awareness sharpened in a way that felt less like clarity and more like heightened vulnerability, as if every detail around him had suddenly become significant. The way people moved, the rhythm of their speech, even the smallest gestures carried an intensity that he could not filter or dismiss. Each observation fed into the growing belief that something was wrong, that something beneath the surface was being concealed from him. Roy remained beside him, steady and composed, continuing to speak with a calm that would have reassured anyone else. He pointed out familiar landmarks along the street, attempting to anchor Sam in a shared reality that had not changed. However, Sam's relationship to that reality had shifted too far for those efforts to fully reach him. The familiarity Roy offered now felt fragile, almost artificial, as though it could collapse at any moment under the weight of doubt. Sam began to notice things he would have previously ignored, small inconsistencies that took on an exaggerated importance in his mind. A passerby who glanced in his direction for a second too long, a door that closed just as he approached, a conversation that stopped abruptly when he came near, all of it seemed to form a pattern, a hidden structure that he could sense but not fully understand. The possibility that these events were ordinary no longer satisfied him. Instead, they became pieces of a larger, more troubling puzzle. The device in his hand continued to anchor these thoughts, its physical presence reinforcing the idea that he was not imagining everything. It felt like evidence, something solid in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. Each time he looked at it, he was reminded that there was at least one thing he could hold onto, one thing that proved his fears might have a basis in reality. Roy eventually guided him to a quieter place, away from the flow of people, where the noise of the street softened into a distant murmur. The change in environment was subtle but intentional, designed to reduce the sensory overload that had been building. For a brief moment, the tension in Sam's body seemed to ease, his breathing slowing as the immediate pressure lessened. Even so, the underlying unease did not disappear. It remained just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest trigger to bring it back into focus. Sam sat down, still clutching the device, his eyes fixed on it as though studying it might reveal answers. His thoughts moved rapidly, cycling through possibilities that became more complex and more unsettling with each iteration. He considered the idea that someone had placed it there deliberately, that it was part of a plan he did not yet understand. Then, almost immediately, he questioned that conclusion, wondering if he had misunderstood what the device was, if it even functioned the way he believed. The uncertainty did not resolve the fear. Instead, it multiplied it, creating layers of doubt that made it impossible to reach a stable conclusion. Roy watched him carefully, aware that Sam was caught in a cycle of thoughts that could not be easily interrupted. He chose his approach with care, focusing on grounding Sam rather than challenging him directly. He spoke about simple, tangible things, encouraging Sam to describe what he was feeling, to articulate the experience in a way that might make it less overwhelming. For a moment, Sam tried to follow that guidance. He attempted to put his thoughts into words, to explain the sequence of events that had led him to this point. However, as he spoke, he became increasingly aware of how fragmented his experience sounded, how difficult it was to distinguish between what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had imagined. The act of explaining only seemed to highlight the instability of his perception. As all this was happening, the warning continued to influence his thinking, subtly altering the way he interpreted Roy's presence. The calm demeanor that had initially provided reassurance now began to feel ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. Sam found himself wondering whether that calmness was genuine or whether it concealed something else, something he could not yet identify. He did not want to distrust Roy, but the idea had already taken root. It did not present itself as a sudden accusation but as a gradual shift, a quiet suggestion that perhaps he should be cautious, that perhaps he should not accept everything at face value. The more he considered it, the more plausible it seemed, until it became another layer of uncertainty he could not shake. Roy, noticing the hesitation in Sam's responses, continued to maintain a steady presence, refusing to withdraw even as the connection between them grew more fragile. He understood that withdrawing too quickly could reinforce Sam's sense of isolation, yet staying too close might also contribute to the pressure Sam was feeling. Balancing those factors required a level of patience and attentiveness that Roy provided instinctively. Meanwhile, Sam's attention began to drift again, pulled away from the immediate conversation by the persistent sense that something was happening beyond his awareness. He glanced around the space, his eyes scanning for movement, for signs that would confirm or deny the suspicions forming in his mind. Each empty corner, each quiet shadow, seemed to hold the possibility of something hidden. The longer he remained in that state, the more his thoughts began to reorganize themselves around a central idea, that the world he was experiencing could not be taken at face value. This was not a sudden realization but a gradual conclusion, built from the accumulation of every confusing, contradictory moment he had experienced over the past days. He began to consider the possibility that the people around him might not fully understand what was happening, that they might be missing something important, or worse, that they might be deliberately ignoring it. This thought did not come with certainty, but it carried enough weight to influence how he interacted with them, creating a subtle distance that had not been there before. Roy's attempts to reassure him continued, but they now encountered resistance that was not immediately visible. Sam listened, nodded, even responded at times, but his engagement was partial, filtered through the growing belief that he needed to be cautious. The connection between them, though still present, had become strained, as if something invisible had come between them. As the conversation unfolded, Sam's mind returned once more to the idea of the trial, of the possibility that he would be asked to speak, to explain everything in front of people who would expect clarity and certainty. The thought felt overwhelming, not only because of the pressure it implied but because it highlighted the instability of his current state. He imagined standing in that environment, trying to recount events that no longer felt entirely real, trying to convince others of something he could not fully convince himself of. The image was enough to trigger another wave of anxiety, his thoughts accelerating as he searched for a way to avoid that outcome, to escape the situation entirely. At the same time, a deeper realization began to emerge, one that he could not easily dismiss. If he could not trust what he experienced, then any decision he made would be based on uncertainty. Whether he chose to speak or remain silent, whether he trusted others or withdrew from them, each choice carried risks he could not fully evaluate. This realization did not bring clarity. Instead, it deepened the sense of being trapped, of being caught in a situation with no clear path forward. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed that every option led to the same place, a place where he would be alone with his thoughts, unable to rely on anything outside of them. Roy, observing the subtle changes in Sam's demeanor, understood that the situation was evolving in a troubling direction. The initial distress had given way to something more complex, something that involved not just fear but a fundamental shift in perception. He remained patient, continuing to offer support, but he also recognized that this might require more than simple reassurance. Sam, however, was already moving further away, not physically, but mentally, retreating into a space where his thoughts felt more real than anything else. The device remained in his hand, a constant reminder of the uncertainty that now defined his world. It was both a source of fear and a point of focus, something he could return to when everything else felt too unstable. As the moments stretched on, the gap between Sam and those trying to help him continued to widen, not through any deliberate action, but through the accumulation of doubt that had taken hold within him. Each passing second reinforced the same underlying question, one that had no clear answer and no easy resolution. And in that uncertainty, the warning remained. Do not trust anyone. It was no longer just a voice in his mind. It was becoming a rule he felt compelled to follow. From that moment onward, the rules Sam had absorbed did not remain abstract or distant. It began to influence his behavior in ways that were subtle at first but quickly became impossible to ignore. It did not manifest as outright defiance or visible panic, but as a quiet withdrawal that deepened with every passing hour, shaping the way he moved through the world and interacted with those around him. He no longer responded to people in the same way, even when they spoke to him gently or tried to reassure him. Instead of engaging fully, he hesitated, as though weighing every word against the possibility that it might conceal something else. His replies became shorter, more guarded, and sometimes delayed, as if he needed extra time to decide whether it was safe to say anything at all. Nick noticed the change almost immediately, though he struggled to understand its cause. He had expected Sam to be upset after everything that had happened, but this was different. It was not just sadness or fear. It was distance, a growing gap that could not be easily bridged by simple explanations or comfort. Each attempt to reach Sam seemed to fall slightly short, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. Toya, too, sensed the shift, though she approached it with a different kind of concern. She watched Sam carefully, noting the way his eyes moved, the way his attention drifted, the way he seemed to be listening to something beyond the conversation taking place. It was not something she could point to directly, but it was enough to make her aware that the situation was becoming more serious than they had initially realized. Sam, however, experienced all of this from a completely different perspective. To him, their concern did not feel like support, it felt like scrutiny. Every question, no matter how gently phrased, carried the weight of expectation, as though they were trying to confirm something about him rather than understand what he was going through. That interpretation did not come from any explicit evidence, but from the accumulation of doubt that had been growing inside him. As the day unfolded, that doubt continued to expand, attaching itself to new observations and reinforcing old fears. The more he tried to make sense of what was happening, the more complicated it became, until even the simplest interactions felt layered with hidden meanings he could not fully decode. The world no longer presented itself as a series of clear, understandable events. Instead, it became a network of possibilities, each one carrying its own potential threat. At the same time, the memory of the tracking device remained central to his thinking, acting as a constant reminder that something external might be influencing his situation. He replayed the moment he had found it over and over again, examining every detail, trying to determine whether he had missed something important. Each time he revisited it, the same conclusion emerged, that it had been placed there intentionally, that it could not simply be explained away as coincidence. That conclusion, once established, began to reshape his understanding of everything else. If someone had placed the device in his bag, then that person must have had access to him, must have been close enough to act without being noticed. The realization narrowed the possibilities in a way that was both clarifying and terrifying, because it suggested that the threat was not distant or abstract, but immediate and personal. Even so, another thought continued to challenge that conclusion, creating a conflict he could not resolve. What if the device was not what he thought it was? What if it was just another misinterpretation, another example of his mind filling in gaps with something that felt real but was not? That possibility did not bring relief. Instead, it deepened the uncertainty, forcing him to confront the idea that he might not be able to trust his own judgment at all. That internal struggle reached a point where Sam could no longer separate his thoughts from his reactions. Each new idea triggered a physical response, his heart racing, his breathing tightening, his muscles tensing, as though his body were responding to a threat that might or might not exist. The distinction between mental and physical became blurred, creating a feedback loop that reinforced itself with every cycle. Meanwhile, Roy continued to play a quiet but crucial role, maintaining a presence that was both patient and consistent. He did not attempt to impose a fixed interpretation on what Sam was experiencing, nor did he dismiss the possibility that something had genuinely frightened him. Instead, he focused on providing stability, offering a point of reference that Sam could return to when everything else felt uncertain. However, even Roy's presence was not immune to the influence of Sam's growing suspicion. The warning he had internalized continued to shape his perception, causing him to question even the most benign actions. When Roy spoke, Sam listened, but part of him remained cautious, alert to any sign that something might be wrong. That caution did not manifest as open distrust, but as a subtle hesitation that prevented him from fully accepting the reassurance being offered. As all this was happening, the anticipation of the trial began to take on a new significance. It was no longer just an event he feared, it became a focal point for his anxiety, a future moment where everything would be tested and exposed. The idea of giving evidence now felt less like a responsibility and more like a risk, something that could potentially make everything worse rather than better. He imagined standing in that courtroom, trying to explain what he had experienced, and the image filled him with a sense of dread that went beyond ordinary fear. It was not just about being judged by others, it was about the possibility of being misunderstood, of having his experiences dismissed or distorted in a way that would leave him even more isolated than before. That fear began to influence his thinking in a new direction, leading him to consider whether it might be safer to say nothing at all, to avoid the situation entirely. The idea did not come as a clear decision, but as a gradual inclination, a sense that withdrawing might be the only way to protect himself from something he could not control. At the same time, the voice that had warned him not to trust anyone remained present, though it no longer needed to speak explicitly. Its message had already been absorbed, becoming part of his internal reasoning. He no longer needed to hear it to feel its influence. It guided his thoughts automatically, shaping his conclusions in ways that felt both natural and unavoidable. As the evening approached, the cumulative effect of everything he had experienced began to weigh heavily on him. The constant tension, the relentless questioning, the inability to find a stable point of reference, it all combined into a state of exhaustion that was both mental and physical. Yet even that exhaustion did not bring rest, because his mind refused to slow down, continuing to search for answers it could not find. The people around him remained present, still trying to reach him, still offering support in the ways they knew how. But the distance between them had grown too large to bridge easily, shaped not by any single event but by the gradual accumulation of doubt and fear that had taken hold within him. And somewhere within that distance, a realization began to form, one that he could not yet fully articulate but could not ignore either. He was no longer just afraid of what he was seeing or hearing. He was afraid of what he might become if he continued to believe it. By the time night settled over Weatherfield, the exhaustion Sam carried was no longer something that could be ignored or pushed aside, yet it refused to offer him any relief. Instead of bringing rest, the quiet darkness seemed to amplify everything he had been trying to suppress, stretching his thoughts into something heavier and more difficult to escape from. The absence of noise did not calm him, it left space for everything inside his mind to grow louder. He lay still for a long time, not fully aware of how much time had passed, his body rigid despite the stillness around him. His eyes remained open, fixed on the faint outlines of the room, as if he needed to confirm repeatedly that everything was still there, unchanged, stable. Yet even as he watched, a sense of instability lingered, subtle but persistent, making it impossible for him to relax into the familiarity of his surroundings. Every small sound carried an exaggerated weight, each creak or distant movement triggering a fresh wave of tension that spread through his body before he could stop it. He listened carefully, trying to distinguish between what was real and what might not be, but the effort itself became exhausting, leaving him caught in a cycle where attention only fed the fear he was trying to control. At the same time, the memory of the voice continued to shape his perception, not through direct repetition, but through the way it had altered his expectations. He no longer assumed that silence meant safety, nor that stillness meant nothing was happening. Instead, he found himself anticipating something unseen, something waiting just beyond his awareness, ready to emerge without warning. That anticipation followed him even into the simplest actions. When he closed his eyes, he did not drift into rest but into a heightened state of alertness, his mind filling in gaps with possibilities that felt just as real as anything he had experienced during the day. Images formed without clear origin, fleeting and incomplete, yet strong enough to leave an impression that lingered long after they faded. He tried to remind himself that none of it was certain, that his thoughts did not necessarily reflect reality, but the effort felt hollow, as though the part of him that could make the distinction had weakened. The more he tried to assert control, the more it slipped away, leaving him with a growing sense that he was no longer fully in charge of his own mind. Meanwhile, outside of his awareness, the concern surrounding him was deepening. Nick had begun to recognize that what Sam was experiencing could not be explained away as temporary distress or a reaction that would resolve itself with time. There was a pattern forming, a progression that pointed toward something more serious, something that required attention beyond reassurance and patience. He did not voice that conclusion immediately, but it lingered in his thoughts, shaping the way he observed Sam's behavior. Toya, in her own way, reached a similar understanding, though she approached it with a sensitivity that kept her from acting too quickly. She had seen moments where Sam seemed almost present, almost connected, only for that connection to slip away again without warning. It was that inconsistency that concerned her most, because it suggested that the problem was not fixed or predictable, but shifting, changing, evolving. As the night stretched on, Sam eventually closed his eyes, not because he felt ready to sleep, but because the effort of keeping them open had become too much. Even then, rest did not come easily. His thoughts continued to move, slower now but no less persistent, circling the same ideas, the same fears, the same unanswered questions. The device he had found remained central to everything, not physically present in his hands anymore, but firmly embedded in his thinking. It had become more than an object, it was a turning point, a moment where uncertainty had taken a more defined shape. Whether it was real or not, whether it meant what he thought it meant, it had already changed the way he saw everything else. As all this was happening, a new layer of fear began to emerge, one that was quieter but no less significant. It was not about being watched or followed, but about the possibility that he might not be able to trust himself at all. The idea did not arrive suddenly, it grew gradually, shaped by each moment of confusion, each contradiction he could not resolve. He began to question not only what he experienced, but how he reacted to it, wondering whether his responses were justified or whether they were part of the problem. This line of thinking did not bring clarity. Instead, it created a deeper level of uncertainty, one that turned inward rather than outward. The next morning did not bring the sense of renewal he might have once expected. Instead, it felt like a continuation of the same unresolved tension, carried over without interruption. The daylight revealed nothing new, yet it did not restore his sense of certainty either. The world looked the same, but it did not feel the same. When he moved through the house, his actions were slower, more deliberate, as though he needed to think through each step before taking it. There was a caution in his movements that had not been there before, a subtle hesitancy that suggested he was no longer fully comfortable in spaces that had once felt familiar. Interactions with others remained strained, not because of anything they did directly, but because of the way he now interpreted those interactions. Every gesture, every word was filtered through the same lens of doubt, making it difficult for him to accept anything at face value. Even kindness felt uncertain, as though it might conceal something else beneath the surface. Roy's presence continued to offer a degree of stability, but even that stability was now fragile, subject to the same questioning that affected everything else. Sam found himself watching Roy more closely, not out of suspicion in the traditional sense, but out of a need to confirm that what he was seeing aligned with what he expected. When it did, there was a brief sense of relief. When it did not, the uncertainty returned immediately. As the day progressed, it became increasingly clear that the situation was not resolving itself, but deepening, moving into a stage where the boundaries between perception and reality were becoming harder to define. The signs were subtle but consistent, forming a pattern that suggested the problem was not temporary, but ongoing. For Sam, however, this progression did not present itself as a clear pattern. It felt more like a series of disconnected moments, each one difficult to interpret, each one leaving behind a trace of confusion that added to everything that had come before. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, even if no single moment seemed definitive on its own. And within that accumulation, the same rule continued to guide him, shaping his responses in ways that felt increasingly instinctive rather than deliberate. Do not trust anyone. It was no longer something he questioned. It was something he was beginning to live by. By the time the following days unfolded, Sam was no longer simply reacting to what was happening around him. He had begun to anticipate it, shaping his behavior according to a reality that existed somewhere between fear and conviction. The change was not sudden or dramatic on the surface, but it was profound, influencing every choice he made in ways that those around him struggled to fully grasp. He moved through his routine with a quiet vigilance that had replaced the natural ease he once carried, as though every action required careful calculation. Even moments that should have been ordinary were now filtered through a constant awareness of potential danger, an awareness that never fully receded. It was not just about what he saw or heard anymore, but about what he expected might happen next. That expectation was shaped by everything he had experienced, but most of all by the lingering uncertainty that had never been resolved. The device he had found, the voice he had heard, the shifting perceptions that had altered his understanding of reality, all of it combined into a single, overarching belief that something was fundamentally wrong, even if he could not define it clearly. Nick and Toya continued to do what they could, trying to maintain a sense of normality while also addressing the growing concern that Sam's behavior was becoming more unpredictable. They spoke to him gently, encouraged him to share what he was feeling, but each attempt seemed to encounter the same barrier, a hesitation that prevented him from fully opening up. It was not that Sam did not want to explain himself. In many ways, he desperately wanted someone to understand what he was going through. But the difficulty lay in the fact that he no longer trusted his own explanation. Every time he tried to put his thoughts into words, he became aware of the contradictions, the gaps, the moments that did not align with what others might consider real. That awareness made him cautious, holding back parts of his experience that felt too uncertain to share. The result was a partial communication that left those around him with an incomplete picture, reinforcing the sense that something was wrong without providing a clear path toward understanding it. Meanwhile, Roy remained a steady presence, continuing to offer support in a way that respected Sam's boundaries while still providing a point of stability. He did not push for answers, nor did he dismiss the possibility that Sam's fears might feel entirely real to him. Instead, he focused on being present, offering a quiet reassurance that did not depend on immediate resolution. However, even that reassurance was no longer enough to fully counter the influence of the warning that had taken root in Sam's mind. The idea that he should not trust anyone had become deeply ingrained, shaping his interpretation of every interaction. It did not manifest as overt suspicion, but as a persistent doubt that lingered beneath the surface, influencing his reactions in subtle but significant ways. As the week progressed, this pattern began to intensify, not through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small moments that reinforced the same underlying fear. Each time something did not align perfectly with his expectations, each time he experienced a brief moment of confusion or uncertainty, the doubt grew stronger, filling in the gaps with possibilities that felt increasingly convincing. At the same time, the possibility that he might be asked to give evidence in the trial continued to loom over him, adding another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. The thought of standing in a courtroom, of being expected to provide a clear and coherent account of events, felt almost impossible under the circumstances. It was not just about fear of judgment, it was about the fear of being unable to trust his own account of what had happened. This fear began to influence his thinking in new ways, leading him to question whether he should participate at all, whether it might be safer to avoid the situation entirely. The idea did not come as a firm decision, but as a growing inclination, shaped by the same uncertainty that had come to define his experience. Even so, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, where clarity seemed within reach. In those moments, Sam could almost see the situation from the outside, could almost recognize that something was not right with the way he was perceiving things. But those moments never lasted long enough to take hold. They faded quickly, replaced once again by the familiar pattern of doubt and fear. As all this was happening, one question began to emerge more clearly than the others, though it remained difficult for Sam to articulate. It was not about whether what he was experiencing was real or not, but about whether he would ever be able to return to a point where that question did not matter. Because that was the deeper fear that had begun to take shape. Not just that he might be wrong, but that he might never feel certain again. And in that uncertainty, the line between reality and imagination continued to blur, leaving both Sam and those around him facing a situation that was far from resolved, and perhaps only just beginning to reveal its true depth.